I didn't expect to see him again, not after all those years and not in that place. But when my ex-boyfriend's son stood there with the same steady eyes I remembered from his childhood, he didn't bring drama or blame. He brought a single memory. One small story from the past that cracked something open in me I didn't realize had sealed shut. And by the time the sun slid behind the trees outside that quiet cafe window, I was holding my coffee with both hands, trying to understand how a person can grow up, look you in the face, and hand you a mirror without ever meaning to. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I was 52 when it happened, old enough to think I'd seen most surprises life had to offer, and smart enough to know that confidence is sometimes just habit wearing a nice coat. That afternoon started like any other errand day. I'd driven across town to drop off a stack of donated books at the library, the kind of quiet favor you do when your weekends don't feel as crowded as they used to. The air had that late fall bite, not harsh yet, just sharp enough to make you pull your collar up and breathe a little slower. The library cafe was busy in that gentle way. People murmuring, pages turning, a barista calling out names like they were announcements in a small neighborhood. I stood in line, scrolling through my phone without really reading anything, when I heard someone say my name. Not loudly, not like a stranger guessing, like someone who knew it. I looked up, and there he was. Ethan. For a second, my mind tried to place him in the wrong time. I saw him as a teenager again, lanky and restless, always pretending he didn't care while caring more than anyone in the room. But the man in front of me had broadened shoulders and a calmer face. The boyish sharpness had softened into something steadier. He wore a simple jacket, no flashy logos, and he had that tired but okay look people get when they've worked hard and learned how to carry it. "Hi," he said, and his voice had changed, lower, more grounded. "I wasn't sure it was you, but it is." I felt my mouth open before I had words ready. "Ethan, wow, you're..." I stopped myself from saying grown, because it sounded obvious and also too emotional. "You're here." He gave a small smile that looked careful, like he didn't want to startle me. "I'm back in town for a few days. My aunt asked me to help with some things." I nodded, as if I understood everything. As if I wasn't suddenly remembering a whole chapter of my life I kept on a high shelf, dusted and untouched. His father, my ex, was a name I hadn't spoken in years. Not because it still hurt in some dramatic way, but because I'd learned that reopening old doors can fill your house with drafts you don't need. We had ended with the kind of quiet finality that looks polite from the outside and feels complicated on the inside. And Ethan had been the innocent middle of it all. "I didn't know you still came to this library," he said, glancing around like the place mattered. "I donate books sometimes," I answered. "It's a habit." He nodded again. Then he hesitated, and I could tell he was deciding whether to keep this as a simple hello or turn it into something else. "Would you mind," he said, "if I bought you a coffee? Just if you have a minute?" A younger version of me might have overthought it, worried what it meant, worried what people would assume. But at 52, I'd learned that kindness is often just kindness, and that life doesn't hand you too many clean chances to close a loop. "I have a minute," I said. We found a small table by the window, where the light fell in a soft rectangle across the wood. Outside, bare branches swayed in the wind, and every now and then a car passed slowly, like the whole day was in no rush. Up close, I could see the familiar parts more clearly. The slight tilt of his eyebrows when he listened, the way he held his cup with both hands like he was warming his fingers and his thoughts at the same time. "How have you been?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but I felt it land deeper than it should have. "I've been okay," I said. "You know, work, life, quiet things." He smiled. "Quiet things can be good." "Sometimes," I agreed. We traded the usual updates. He told me he lived a few states away now, that he had a job he liked more than he expected, that he'd learned to cook a few reliable meals. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy. But the longer we spoke, the more I noticed how present he was, how he didn't rush his sentences. He wasn't trying to impress me. He was simply there. Then, after a pause, he set his cup down gently and looked at me like he'd been holding something back. "I've wanted to say something to you," he began, and the tone of his voice changed, still calm, but more serious. My stomach tightened in that old human way, bracing for blame or old pain. "I'm listening," I said carefully. He took a breath. "It's not bad. Not like that." He glanced down at his hands, then back up. "It's just a memory, and I don't know why it's been on my mind lately, but it has." I didn't speak. I let him take the space. He leaned back a little, eyes drifting toward the window, as if the glass could show him the past. "I was 15, he said, "maybe 16. It was around the time things were tense at home." He paused, choosing words that didn't accuse anyone. "And you and my dad were going through your own stuff. I could feel it." My throat tightened. I remembered that time, the way arguments could hide behind closed doors, but still seep into the hallway. Ethan continued. "There was this one night. My dad had gone out, and I was in the kitchen pretending I wasn't hungry because I didn't want to talk to anyone." He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. I was good at that, pretending. I nodded. I remembered him like that, quiet in his own storm. "And you," he said, "you didn't push. You didn't lecture. You just made grilled cheese." I blinked. Of all the things he could have brought up, I hadn't expected that. He laughed softly, like he knew how ordinary it sounded. "I know. It's such a dumb detail. But I remember the sound of the pan, and the way you cut it in half like it mattered. And you put it on a plate, slid it across the counter, and said, 'You don't have to talk. Just eat something warm.'" My hands tightened around my coffee cup. "I didn't say anything," he went on. "I just ate. But I remember thinking, someone sees me, not as a problem, not as an attitude, just as a kid having a hard time." He looked straight at me then. That moment did something for me. I didn't realize it until later. But it taught me that care doesn't have to be loud to be real. For a second, I couldn't speak, because my mind had been holding that time as a failure, an ending, a mess, a love that didn't work. And here was this grown man telling me that in the middle of it, I'd done something right without even trying to. I didn't know. I managed, my voice quieter than I intended. "I know you didn't," he said gently. "That's why I wanted to tell you now." I stared at the table, at a small scratch in the wood, trying not to get pulled under by the feeling rising in my chest. It wasn't romance. It wasn't regret. It was something older and steadier, like being reminded your life has echoes you never hear. "I'm glad," I said, swallowing. "I'm glad it mattered." "It did," he said, "more than you'd think." We sat in silence for a moment, and it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of pause that feels earned. Then he added, "And there's another part, if it's okay." I lifted my eyes. "Go on." He hesitated again, respectful, like he didn't want to step over a line. "After you and my dad split," he said, "I told myself a story about it. I told myself, people leave because you're not worth staying for." I didn't say it out loud, but it sat in my head for years. My heart pinched. I wanted to interrupt, to say no, that wasn't it. but I knew better than to argue with someone's old wound. He continued, but the older I got, the more I realized it wasn't about worth. It was about adults being human, about complicated choices, about two people not fitting anymore. I let out a slow breath, realizing I'd been holding mine. And I realized, he said, that you weren't the villain in my story. You were just someone trying, and you tried with me too. His words landed like a soft weight, because in my version of the past, I'd always wondered if I'd failed him by leaving. Even if leaving had been necessary, I'd still carried that question like a pebble in my shoe. I thought about you sometimes, he said, not in a stuck way, just wondering if you were okay. I gave a small, shaky smile. I am. I've learned a lot. Me too, he said, and then he looked at me with an expression that made me sit up straighter. That's kind of why I wanted to meet today. Not to dig up anything painful, just to say thank you. And maybe to hear your side of it if you ever wanted to share. I stared at him, at how patiently he waited, how he offered instead of demanded, and I realized something that surprised me. I'd spent years thinking that chapter ended with a door slam, but maybe it ended with a quiet sentence I never got to say. Outside, the wind moved the branches again, and a few leaves skittered across the sidewalk like they were late to somewhere. I set my cup down slowly. I can share, I said, but I might need a second to find the right words. He nodded. Take your time. And in that moment, sitting across from the son of a man I once loved, I felt the strange, tender truth of it. Life doesn't always give you closure the way movies do. Sometimes it gives you a grilled cheese memory and a chance to speak honestly in a sunlit cafe, years later, when everyone has grown enough to handle it with care. I sat there longer than I meant to, staring at the faint ring my coffee cup had left on the table, as if it were a map I needed to read carefully. Ethan didn't rush me. He leaned back slightly, hands folded, giving me the kind of space that says, I'm here when you're ready. That alone told me he wasn't the restless teenager I once knew. He learned patience, maybe the hard way. When your father and I were together, I began slowly. I thought being strong meant holding everything together quietly. I thought if I didn't make waves, no one would get hurt. He listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, not searching for blame. But I was wrong, I continued. I didn't realize that silence can feel heavier than honesty, especially for a kid who's already trying to read the room. I paused, feeling the weight of those old days settle in my chest. I worried about you. I just didn't know how to say it without making things worse. He nodded once, thoughtful. I could tell you worried, even when you didn't say much. That surprised me. You could. Yes, he said. You paid attention. You noticed when I stayed up late. You asked if I had homework, even when I shrugged you off. That stuff sticks. I felt a warmth spread through me, mixed with something bittersweet. All those small moments I dismissed as not enough had clearly mattered. I left because I was afraid, I admitted, not of your father exactly, but of becoming someone who stayed out of obligation instead of truth. I didn't want resentment to turn me into someone unkind. Ethan's gaze softened. That makes sense now. It didn't then, but it does now. We sat quietly again, the cafe noise filling the space between us, cups clinking, a chair scraping softly across the floor. Outside, a man walked past with his dog, bundled up against the cold. Ordinary life continuing, as it always does, even when something important is unfolding inside you. There's something else I've been thinking about, Ethan said after a moment. About memory. I looked up. What about it? About how we carry versions of people with us, he said. I carried a version of you that was gentle, steady, someone who showed me what calm looked like when things weren't calm at home. My throat tightened again, but this time I let the feeling come. "I didn't know I was teaching anything," I said softly. "Most people don't," he replied. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, not because the topic was secret, but because it deserved care. "When I became an adult, I had to unlearn some things. I had to learn that connection doesn't mean control, that respect doesn't have to be loud. And honestly, a lot of that started with how you treated me back then." I shook my head gently, overwhelmed. "You give me too much credit." "No," he said, firm but kind. "I'm just finally naming it." I thought about all the times I'd questioned my choices, all the nights I'd replayed the past wondering who I'd disappointed. And here was this man, sitting across from me, telling me that something good had grown in the cracks. "Life is strange," I said. "You think you're closing a door, and years later you realize someone else walked through it and carried a piece of you with them." He smiled at that. "Yeah, strange and humbling." The conversation drifted then, easing into lighter territory. He told me about a project at work that challenged him, about how he learned to slow down instead of pushing through everything. I shared small details about my life, how I'd taken up early morning walks, how silence didn't scare me anymore. At one point he glanced at his watch, then back at me. "I don't want to keep you too long," he said. I'm glad this happened." The days after that meeting felt different, like the air had shifted just enough to make me notice my own thoughts more clearly. I went back to my routines: morning coffee by the window, a walk around the block before the day fully woke up, but everything seemed to carry a faint echo of that conversation. Not in a heavy way, in a thoughtful one. I kept thinking about what Ethan had said about memory, about how we carry versions of people with us. I'd wondered who I was carrying without realizing it, and who might be carrying a version of me I'd long forgotten. One evening, as I sorted through an old box in the hall closet, I found a photo tucked inside a paperback book. It was from years ago, a casual snapshot taken in the backyard. I was standing near the grill, hair pulled back, smiling at something outside the frame. Ethan was there too, younger, holding a plate, looking halfway between amused and unsure. I hadn't remembered that photo until it was suddenly in my hands. I sat down on the floor, the box forgotten, and studied it. We looked like ordinary people in an ordinary moment. No tension visible, no sign of endings, just a slice of time that had kept going without me. It struck me then how often we judge our past selves without the full picture. I'd spent years focusing on what didn't work, on what I couldn't fix. But Ethan's words had quietly challenged that story. They suggested there had been steadiness where I'd assumed there was only failure. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize at first. It was Ethan. He wrote simply, "Hope you've been well. I've been thinking about our conversation. Thank you again." I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then replied, "I have been. And thank you for trusting me with that memory." His response came a little later. It made me reflect on some things I hadn't realized I was still carrying. In a good way. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, feeling a quiet sense of connection. Not something demanding, not something confusing, just a shared understanding that two people had reached at different points in their lives and finally met in the middle. That weekend, I drove out to a small park near the river, a place I hadn't visited in years. I used to go there when I needed to think, when I was younger and unsure of my footing. The benches were the same, worn smooth by time and weather. I sat down, listening to the water move steadily past, and let my thoughts wander. I realized I'd spent a long time believing that growth meant moving on and never looking back. But maybe growth also means revisiting moments with new eyes, allowing them to teach you something different than they did the first time. Ethan hadn't come back into my life to reopen anything. He'd come back as a reminder that care doesn't vanish just because circumstances change. That being present, even briefly, can shape someone in ways you'll never see until years later. I thought about the men I'd known, the relationships that had started and ended, the ways I'd learned to protect myself by staying quiet. I wondered how many times I'd been kinder than I gave myself credit for. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in a long while. I didn't plan it. The words just came. I wrote about that kitchen years ago, about the sound of the pan heating up, about choosing to cut a sandwich in half because it felt like the right thing to do. I wrote about how small gestures can become anchors for someone else, even when you don't know they're struggling. As I closed the journal, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. Not closure exactly, more like clarity. The next morning, another message from Ethan waited on my phone. He told me he was leaving town soon, heading back to his life. But before he did, he wanted me to know something. I read his words slowly, letting each one land. I'm trying to live more honestly now, to say things when they matter. Meeting you reminded me that people can impact each other without meaning to, and that's something I want to be more aware of. I smiled, a soft, grateful smile meant only for myself. His journey was his own, just as mine was mine. But our paths had crossed at exactly the right moment to remind us both of something important. I typed back, I'm glad our paths crossed again. Safe travels. When I set the phone down, I noticed how light the room felt, how the morning sun filled it without effort. Life hadn't changed dramatically. Nothing external had shifted, and yet inside me, something had realigned. I understood now that reflection isn't about regret. It's about recognition. Recognizing the moments where you were truer than you realized. Recognizing that your story is larger than its endings. And as I stepped outside that morning, breathing in the cool air, I felt ready for whatever final understanding this reflection might still bring. The morning he left town, I didn't hear from Ethan again, and I realized I didn't need to. Some exchanges finish exactly when they should, without a goodbye that stretches longer than its meaning. I carried the quiet of it with me as I went about my day, feeling steady in a way I hadn't expected. A week later, I found myself telling the story to a close friend over dinner. Not every detail, just the shape of it. I watched her face as I spoke, how she nodded at the right moments, how her eyes softened when I mentioned the memory Ethan had shared. It sounds like you gave him something important, she said. I shook my head gently. I think we gave each other something. That stayed with me. For years, I had measured my life by the big moments, the beginnings, the endings, the decisions that felt heavy at the time. But this experience shifted my attention to the quieter spaces in between, the moments where you show up without an audience, where you act out of simple care rather than obligation or fear. I thought about the men watching this story now, men who've lived long enough to know that life rarely gives you neat conclusions. I imagined them nodding, maybe thinking of someone they once crossed paths with, someone whose life brushed against theirs in a way they never fully understood. What I learned from Ethan wasn't about the past as much as it was about the present, about how every interaction still holds potential, no matter your age, about how respect and honesty don't expire, and about how being steady for someone, even briefly, can leave a mark that time doesn't erase. One afternoon, I returned to the library cafe, sitting at the same small table by the window. The light fell differently this time, brighter, more confident. I ordered the same coffee and watched people come and go, each carrying their own stories, their own silent reflections. I realized I no longer saw that chapter of my life as unfinished. It was complete in a way I hadn't recognized before. Not because everything worked out perfectly, but because understanding had finally arrived, unannounced, unexpected, and deeply welcome. As I stood to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass door. A woman in her 50s, standing straight, eyes clear. Someone who had lived, learned, and continued forward without bitterness. And that, I think, is the real gift of reflection. Not regret, not longing, but growth. So if there's one thing I take with me now, it's this: You never know which small kindness will become someone else's quiet strength, and you may never hear about it until years later, if at all, but that doesn't make it any less real. Sometimes, life circles back not to reopen old wounds, but to show you how much good quietly grew where you once thought nothing had survived. And when that happens, all you can do is accept it with gratitude, breathe it in, and continue living a little more honestly than you did before.